No matter if you're a reader, a writer, or just a woman wanting to understand her own quest in life, this episode is for you. I will unpack the heroine's journey, and I will do so from two perspectives. First of all, literature, which seems the easy way to go, and psychology. You can take notes for your own life and for your new books that you're writing, so let's jump right in. Hey there, and welcome to the Mugcast, a cozy listen to pair with your coffee. I'm Hannah, the writer behind Hug in a Mug on Medium, where I cover everything from music to psychology and living abroad as a woman. Here I read my stories aloud with a few fresh reflections along the way and some insights. So grab your mug, settle in, and let's get into today's piece. Hi to everyone who's tuning in to today's episode. I'm so excited to have you here. I want to apologize first and foremost because this is the first time that I'm recording during daytime, which means there might be some more car sounds, some more weird background noises. I'm very, very sorry. I will go back, listen to this and edit it, and maybe in the audio editing I can remove some of that sound, but if I can't, I'm very sorry. I live in Taiwan. It's a little bit noisy here. To be honest, I love the noises of Taiwan. It makes me feel very homey, but I get that for a podcast episode, maybe that's not what you want to hear. So I want to keep today's introductory rumbling to a minimum because I have a very interesting and important episode to bring today, which is The Heroine's Journey, a psychological tool for every woman. I wrote this article 2 months ago, and you can find the original article, as always, in the info box below. If you just hit the link, you will be able to read along with what I'm reading. You can take notes inside the app. You can highlight things inside the app. I think that's a really good chance for you to not just listen to this podcast episode, but if you really want to take home some of the lessons and some of the materials, you can just click the link and take your own notes and save them in a folder so you'll always be able to remember it. I think actually today's episode has a lot of new insights in terms of the psychological domain, but also if you're interested in travel, I'm going to be talking about the heroine's journey in Korean literature as well. And you might be thinking, why is she recording an article that she wrote 2 months ago now? The reason is that 2 months ago, I was still on a journey through Korea. And at that time, I had no availability of any place where I could record properly. So that's the first reason. Second reason is I recorded this actually a month ago. And after that recording, I didn't feel really good about how I'd recorded it, and I had rambled for too long, which is why I want to keep it short today because I know this is a topic I really care about, so I want to get to reading. Today, I want to kind of take a different take on this article. I will be reading the part on the heroine's journey, and then I will add some more recent learnings that I've had about the same topic. So I don't want to keep you waiting. Let's jump right in. The Heroine's Journey, a psychological tool for every woman. Recently, I stumbled upon another great resource that could feed many women's curiosity on why they are the way they are, and further, why the way they are is so distinct from the way that men just are. I promise this will remain the most cryptic sentence in this entire article. In the following, I would like to introduce you to the book The Heroine's Journey by Maureen Murdoch and compare it to the female heroine's journey in Korean literature. Both have a great impact on the highly underestimated and under-researched domain of female psychology. So as already mentioned, female psychology is a criminally under-researched domain. Most studies seem to end on the note that either women are just too hormonally imbalanced to research them, or women are just more emotionally available and empathetic, and that explains their psychological differences. But I think that's a blanket excuse to avoid saying we don't know or we don't want to invest the money to actually research. I mean, great. We knew that women are empathetic and maybe more emotionally available, and a lot of that is circling around the topic of gender stereotypes. But what do we do with this information? How does this help women? The first discovery I made in the world of female psychology was the book The Goddess in Every Woman, and this is written by Jane Shinoda Bolin. This book got a lot of attention in the early 2020s as it was amply abused for influencers, and they would use it for the domain of femininity, and tests of finding your inner goddess were kind of circulating around the internet everywhere, but almost all of these reproductions failed to reach the actual depth that Jane Shinoda Bolin covered in her book. And Bolin is a psychologist working primarily with women, so she has a lot of insights. This cat is already annoying me. What the fuck? Cat, shut the fuck up. I think this is so loud. It would definitely be in the audio. Okay. In her book, she goes in depth on how a woman is likely not one or the other goddess, but she describes in mind-boggling detail and relatability how the journey of each of these archetypes, which were inspired by Carl Jung's archetypes, are related to fables that were told about these goddesses in ancient times. Her goal was certainly not to create a personality test, which one can use to find out how to dress accordingly to your inner goddess. Since then, I've had the pleasure of attending a class on feminism and cultural feminism in Korea, which taught me more about globally important feminist and gender studies and the topics that are being overlooked. In the course of these months, my algorithm has shifted slightly because suddenly a channel called Breaking Down Patriarchy, which beautifully explains many concepts I wish I had learned about in school, suddenly showed up on my feed. And just a few days ago, I was given this YouTube video by the gods, which is completely changing my outlook. And the YouTube video I'm talking about is also linked in the article that I have linked in the info box below. The YouTube video I'm referring to is called Why Women Need Their Own Myth, and it's on this YouTube channel called Breaking Down Patriarchy. You can find it here on YouTube, and I find it highly, highly, amazingly informative. Again, I think this YouTube channel is basically like a Bible for all the things that I feel like women should learn, but they actually are never being taught. For some context, this was not the first time that I'd learned about female heroines' journeys, but before I'd learned about a completely different one. Now we're jumping into the part where I'm so excited and so honored to thank my Korean professor, Professor Kim. Thank you very much. Because during my last year's Korean lecture, she taught me about the Korean female heroine's journey, which, I'm very, very grateful to Professor Kim for teaching me this, and I'm so excited to share it on here. Last semester, in my Korean literature class, I learned about the Korean Heroes arc, which is based on Joseph Campbell's Heroes arc from the 1920s. This Heroes arc from Joseph Campbell is famously the origin for both the Heroine's Journey by Maureen Murdoch, the psychology book, and other heroines' journeys around the world in literature. My professor explained that the Korean hero's journey has the following steps that are kind of a little bit different from Joseph Campbell's Heroes arc. First, a son is born with noble lineage, and then secondly, he miraculously is conceived and given extraordinary abilities. Usually this comes with a conception dream, which is a very common thing to occur in Korean stories. A lot of Koreans that I met, interestingly, knew their parents' or parents' friends' conception dreams, which is very interesting to me. Third of all, the hero that is born with these extraordinary abilities and in this noble lineage is separated from his parents. And then he's placed in some sort of fatal danger. After being placed in that fatal danger, he's rescued by a helper, which is sometimes represented by a Buddhist monk, and then he escapes the danger. After the escaping, he grows up and faces that danger that he was kind of born into. And finally, he overcomes the crisis and achieves the victory, which usually happens on two ends. Basically, the hero will overcome the state level journey by winning a war or just overcoming his enemies more generally. But simultaneously, internally, he will find his royal roots or where he came from. So the kind of overcoming the crisis happens both on a larger scale level as well as an internal level. And this structure can be found in many hero stories throughout the Joseon dynasty in historic Korea. And now I will butcher some names, please excuse this, such as the story of Yu Chong-yeol or the story of Hong Gil-dong, which are Korean heroes' tales. Let's dive into Korean history for a little bit to understand this. During that time, King Sejong famously constructed the Hangul alphabet to overcome the admin complications caused by the Chinese script, which was not very easy to learn. And thus, it caused a lot of problems with reflecting and translating it to the people that were actually living in Korea at the time. Also, the Chinese script didn't perfectly represent the Korean language. So he created a script that was famously easy to learn, and then suddenly the lower classes, also women included, would become more literate. Suddenly, women started writing their own stories, mostly in Hangul, which were regarded as lower class literature because, in contrast to the factual texts that were still written with Hanja, or Chinese characters, the lower class literature was invented stories by women. They were written in Hangul and they were basically tales instead of retellings from previous wars in history. However, these stories, I guess, much like romantasy today, spread like wildfire among the common public. And many women were either engaged in copying these novels or writing them, or they were reading them to the noble Yangban women who are like noble women. They were confined to the back of their traditional housing, so they couldn't go out to purchase these books themselves, so they would send somebody else to buy these books or copy these books or read these books to them. These female novels didn't just stop at portraying male heroes or writing about romance, they also started gender switching their characters to women and explored these dynamics. So what happened is, in stories like the story of Hong Ye-wol or the story of Bang Han-lim, there's a woman who goes through the hero's arc, basically becoming a female hero or heroine. In these stories, my professor pointed out the following heroine's journey. And this is something I have included in the article as well. If you want to see the overview of how the timeline of how the heroine's journey in these books takes place, you can see the image in the article that I linked below. So I already walked you through the hero's journey. Now, before the hero is able to go on his journey and overcome all the adversities, a female hero in Korean literature cross-dresses. So basically, before the hero can even go on the journey, they pretend to be men. Then they can walk through the entire hero's journey as normal, but at the end, after having resolved their conflict, they are usually being uncovered. So usually somebody finds out, sometimes the love interest, sometimes somebody else, that these male figures were actually women in the background. And this drives a lot of tension between husbands, rivals, and villains. And it really drives up the internal strength of the female hero. Resolution sometimes comes through the king, who's the highest figure in the Joseon-dynasty hierarchy, in the Confucianist hierarchy, I should say. But basically, the woman kind of resolves her conflict again after being discovered as an actual woman. And at the end, she usually receives recognition and rewards either by the ruler, or she's generally acknowledged, or she gains some kind of rank, some honor, basically something that was far out of reach for any woman at the time. Basically, the slide emphasizes how the heroine's journey in classic Korean female Hangul written novels is an extension of the hero's journey. First, the women cross-dress as men, then they go through the entire hero's arc only to step into the conflict with the male figure after what would have been the end in a man's story. After that, and here there is quite some variation depending on the different stories and copies, but usually she gains some recognition, gets higher rank, restores family dignity in a way that would have been realistically unthinkable for any woman at the time. The interesting cracking point of these stories is always the fight with their lover, when he discovers that she's actually a woman, or especially the point at which the women reached higher fame than their husband. In the story of Bang Han-lim, the woman even marries another woman at the end. So there is a queer story in Joseon-dynasty Hangul novels, which I find fascinating. Mind you, these are all historic tales. I was so thoroughly impressed with the feminist literature at that time because it was written presumably around 1883 or sometime around the late Joseon dynasty. If you want to watch a similar tale today, I would recommend the drama The King's Affection on Netflix, which, fun fact, is one of the first K-dramas I ever watched. But it deals especially with those plot devices of a girl cross-dressing and then being revealed later on. Also, which other classic story does that remind you of? Take a second to think. What story includes a girl cross-dressing? If you said Mulan, you would be correct. Because Mulan's origins are actually Chinese and far older than the stories I just talked about. And historically, it's hard to characterize what her story is actually based on and whether it's real material or just invented tales. There's a lot of lore behind the history of Mulan. It's kind of sad how Disney broke it down because the story has so many reiterations and so many beautiful plot points that were completely missed by Disney. But yeah, Mulan is a really, really old heroine's tale. On top of that, I want you to keep in mind that this heroine's arc that I'm talking about in Korean literature as well as in Mulan naturally occurred much earlier in female imaginations and in literature than the hero's journey by Joseph Campbell, because Joseph Campbell only figured out the hero's journey in 1949. And Maureen Murdoch wrote the book The Heroine's Journey, the psychological heroine's journey, in 1990, which is also much, much later. Yet, despite both of these female heroines' journey being rooted in literature from fundamentally different cultures, they share some clear characteristics. Which brings me to the time that I need to explain to you The Heroine's Journey by Maureen Murdoch. Here's a visualization because I need it as much as you do. And this graph is linked in the article again. For those of you who don't have the article open, I'll quickly walk you through it. So Maureen Murdoch's The Heroine's Journey starts with a shift from the feminine to the masculine. The second part is a road of trials. The third part is the illusion of success. The fourth part is the descent, which is all of these four basically are the hero's journey as we know it before. A hero that rises, goes on a road of trials, and succeeds and has a happy ending. But instead of it being just a happy ending and just a success, Maureen Murdoch says there's only an illusion of success, and then she descends into actually questioning herself. Because after the end of that male hero's arc, the, I guess, psychological heroine's journey starts. Part 5 is the female hero, after the descent, meets with the goddess and then has to reconciliate with her inner feminine. After reconciliating with her inner feminine, she has to reincorporate the masculine. And only after she's gone through these internal incorporation steps will she reach point 8, the final destination, the union. First of all, one striking similarity is that the shift from feminine to masculine, which also occurs in Korean heroines' tales, in Murdoch's book, this transition is less of a physical one. It's more of a stepping into your traditionally masculine behavior or to your animus in terms of Jungian psychology. So it is striking to me that a woman who probably had no knowledge of the Korean Joseon-dynasty heroine's arc would also characterize this first step of women have to step into their masculine before they can actually become heroes. Because maybe as a society, we've tied the concept of a hero so strongly to a man that it's actually impossible for us as a woman to go through that same arc. Or secondly, and I think that interpretation is even more interesting, women have to become more masculine to start a hero's journey because our society doesn't even open that opportunity for women. A woman needs to pretend to be more male to reach certain achievements. And I think that rings true in our lives. Imagine a typical office setting. Women are required to step up more and be more masculine to reach higher positions, right? So this idea of a woman stepping into the masculine in our society doesn't only symbolize a woman becoming more male, actually. It means on a more psychological level, a woman has to step up more, step into her masculine more. A woman can't be empathetic and kind to reach higher positions. That's oftentimes the narrative, right? If you're a CEO, there's a reason you became a CEO, and usually these people weren't the nicest. And this kind of plays into the heroine's journey on a psychological as well as literature level. The second part, the road of trials, and the third part, the illusion of success, are where the regular hero's arc occurs in Korean literature and also in Joseph Campbell's hero's arc. And the descent marks the point at which the female main character gets into conflict with the male characters. So, after all of that male journey, through the meeting with the goddess, a woman kind of goes on the more important, maybe, internal journey. Though meeting with the goddess doesn't directly occur in Korean novels, oftentimes the emperor or king in the novels plays the role of the affirmative supporter. And that then ends the feud between the female lead and the male lead, who's the love interest usually. Because usually what happens is when the woman uncovers that she's actually a woman and just cross-dressed as a man, her lover gets upset. One could say that in Confucian ideology, the king's approval was the ideal ending to any story. Whereas in Murdoch's story, 100 years later, and in the US, it is more realistically set in the psyche of a woman. And the woman recognizes that external validation doesn't solve the situation, which I guess is a point that was not very commonly made in Korean culture. Because in Confucianist culture, one of the best things that could happen to you was approval of the king. So I guess each heroine's journey takes place within its local cultural boundaries. Murdoch adds the reconciliation with the feminine and the reincorporation of the masculine to the arc, which finish in the unition. And this is a very psychoanalytical Jungian idea. As so often with Jungian psychology, the psychological aspects here get entangled with myths, which is why these stories are so often found decontextualized in some video by somebody who wants to be a feminine role model on social media. But the basic intrigue, even in those simplified versions, still remains. Why is it that women in Korea thought of a similar story structure when writing heroine stories set in a completely different Confucian state as what Marine Murdoch discovered in the late 20th century in Western ancient myths and Western women's minds? It's so interesting to me that in Korea, a completely different culture, thousands of kilometers away, possibly hundreds of years earlier, women were already thinking in the same structure, in the same heroine's arc. They were already thinking that women need to take these same steps as another woman in 1990 would discover in female psychology. It seems unrelated, but it's one of those things where I'm excited that literature or arts, I guess, more broadly speaking, touch the domain of psychology, because literature and arts are never disconnected from the humans that made them. I guess the Jungian and heavily discussed answer would be that these cultures have a shared subconscious. Call it a shared subconscious or a general human trait or just a human condition thing, but I find that the meeting point between fantasy, imagination, and myth is actually where psychology gets extremely intriguing and also extremely tricky. Of course, there is the risk of overstepping into spirituality, which I personally really don't buy into, but even I can't deny that there's a pull of such theories to me as a writer, as a reader, and as a woman. Now I'm quickly going to go into my heroine's arc to give you an example of how this might look. Also, I can't deny that I find myself mirrored in this concept of the heroine's journey myself. I highly recommend watching the YouTube video I mentioned before for a short introduction because I was absolutely baffled how painfully accurate this is in terms of my own description and how I map my life and my lived experiences. I've written previously about being a daddy's girl and not finding my position as one too bad. Also, I've been vocal about wanting to forgive more in my life. And as a woman who moved abroad and actively chases her dreams, I find myself frequently wearing more of the animus than the anima cap, which is possibly why this rediscovering your femininity wave didn't even pass my masculinized brain without scratching an itch. A simple summary would be that I think I stepped into my masculine sometime in high school. I had to defend myself more, I had to step up for my friends, and I found a lot of joy in that. My whole life then was not about making more and more friends, but it seemed like it was more about proving those who didn't like me wrong. It was like a story of finding rivals. I collected enemies like the current generation does labubos, and the ultimate act of proving everyone wrong was when I moved away. I read about this extensively in my book, how moving abroad was almost like an act of revenge for me. So this was kind of like my road of trials. And then I reached my dream, arrived in Taiwan, and I lived this dreamlike life, which I can't describe better than the illusion of success. Upon my arrival in South Korea, though, half a year ago, I fell into a depressive state because I hadn't really set myself up yet in the way that I wanted to. And all of this sounds very, very eerily similar to what Murdoch describes as the descent. For me, the descent wasn't a single moment. Rather, it was like a compilation of this ever-increasing lostness and the nagging feeling that I'd left something unfinished and the fact that my story wasn't supposed to be over, but it seemed like the book was written. It was all like there was this grand gesture that I wanted to end my time abroad with, which was moving out to Korea. But then that was not yet the end. It wasn't over. I had moved to Korea, but life kept going. I have no grand meeting with the goddess moment. Some women have it very clearly. I guess I really didn't recognize it. But I currently notice how, ironically, I'm really tapping into this healing my mother wound and like healing my feminine type of thing. Now, this is where I end the reading because that's kind of the state that I'm currently in. I'm really exploring a lot of female myths at this moment. I really loved the myth of Psyche, for instance, and I want to bring this up really quickly here because I think it really relates to this heroine's journey. The myth of Psyche is a story from the ancient Greek and Roman period. It comes from several different sources, so you might hear different people tell the story differently. Beauty and the Beast is part of the story because there's this house of living creatures who she can't see, who all speak to her and tend to her. There's this idea of the beast in there as well. There's the idea of sorting the little beans into piles, which comes from Cinderella. So a lot of the later on Grimm stories or European fairy tales lend a lot of material from this original Psyche tale. And the Psyche tale, again, kind of resembles this hero's arc where she is sent by Aphrodite on these quests. Though she's a bit of a whiny hero, to be honest, she does have to overcome everything on her own. And it's not this typical hero's arc where she's just fighting like a Perseus or like an Ulysses. He's not just fighting and like winning everything. She actually has emotions and cares and also goes through this integration process of her internal strength. So that's why I love the story as well. But I find it fascinating because this is the tale that a lot of fairy tales are based on. And this tale still has a lot of agency. The woman goes and sends her sisters into sure death. She literally tells them to jump off a cliff, which is fucking good revenge in my eyes. But through time, and this is similar to how Cupid kind of became a baby instead of a sexy man when Christianity was on the rise, I guess in a similar vein, these tales became more embedded as stories that are representative of Christian values. And Christian values don't necessarily mean for women to practice revenge, but they do actually enforce that like women end up meeting a beautiful husband and they end up having babies and they become goddesses or queens, I guess is the equivalent in the European literature. But it's interesting how from an original tale about Psyche that was written before Christ, through the centuries where we became more and less Catholic, these tales around women changed. The heroine's journey changed. They kept referencing this tale of Psyche, but ignored all the parts that had female advocacy in them, even to the slightest. So that's why I quickly wanted to wrap up this episode with telling you the story of Psyche, because she's the basis for a lot of the fairy tales that we think of when we traditionally think of women's stories, princess stories, fairy tales. The Psyche tale is the origin for a lot of those materials, but it just got twisted through time into not actually being a hero's tale anymore. Old Greek people would have been able to tell a story of a strong woman, but throughout the centuries we kind of lost that ability for a lot of different reasons. But it's very interesting to me. I think it really ties into the heroine's journey because it's a good counterpart to how in the Joseon dynasty people were actually able to imagine these heroines' tales and give women advocacy because they switched into the masculine role, which is something that women seemingly psychologically still need to do until today, possibly because of the construct of patriarchy. But I digress. Finally, I want to say thank you for granting me access to your ears on the Mugcast. You can read more of my writing on Medium under Hannah's Cafe or Hug in a Mug, or you can follow me on Instagram at hugin.amug for cozy content and updates. If you enjoy this episode, don't forget to follow this podcast, and you can share it with a fellow coffee lover and let me know in the comments which articles I should be reading next. I hope you had a nice cappuccino with this episode, and I'm sending a warm hug from my mug to yours. Hope to see you soon somewhere on Hannah's Cafe. Bye bye.